Would you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Lewis, all ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lewis, Kingspan Part 2. I'd like to go back to that topic, please. Can we go to your witness statement at page 14, paragraph 58? And there, under the heading Kingspan General Points, you say, NHBC's relationship with Kingspan in the period from 2005 to 2017 was not particularly good, but it was a professional relationship. We felt that they were being evasive and hiding the truth. They were a big organisation who seemed to feel that they could drive the market. I tried to distance myself and politely refused the offers to visit their factory. I wish to maintain a professional distance. What were the main reasons for the, as you put it, less than good relationship with Kingspan?
The first meeting with Kingspan was okay. It's quickly sort of led to us not being fully trusting of what they were saying.
Forgive me, just to cut through you, but
Sorry.
you've identified the period from 2005 as the period during which it was not particularly good. Is that right?
To be honest, no, that really would be more from 2013 to 2017. I didn't have any really relationship with Kingspan prior to that. Okay. Apologies.
Now, so can we be clear then that it was only during the period from 2013 that you felt that they were being evasive and hiding the truth?
Yes.
Right. And those factors which meant that the relationship was not particularly good, is that right?
That's right, yes.
So before 2013, what was the relationship with Kingspan like?
We didn't have one.
You didn't have one? Well, one way or the other?
Just
I see.
Our paths never crossed.
Right, your paths never crossed. Okay, so now if we go to page 13 of your witness statement, please, back a page to paragraph 59. I'm sorry, top of page 14. That's what we want. No, I'm sorry, my note is wrong. 15. Paragraph 59B at the top of page 15 is what we want. And you say there, once we had the meeting with Wintec in November 2013, I drilled down more into Kingspan's marketing literature and questioned them regarding the change of wording to the BBA certificate and the fact that there was only one BS 8414 fire test. As we learnt more about Kingspan, we learnt that their knowledge base was very limited. How is their knowledge base limited?
That when we quizzed Kingspan as to what evidence they had for the combustibility and the use of their product, we found that there was just the single 8414 test, and then apart from that, the BBA certificate and the LABC approval.
Now, you've referred in your statement to writing to the Kingspan Technical Helpline on the 26th of November. Can we look at the email you sent? It's at NHB 50644. And if we go to page 5 of this email run, I just want to ask you, page 5 there, we can see an email of the 26th of November to KIL PB Tech Line Inquiries. Is that the email that you're referring to in your statement when you say you wrote to their helpline?
It is, yes.
It is. Now then, let's trace it up the chain to page 3. Just very quickly, we can do that. Page 3, we can see you provide details of a specific project, which is St Pancras Way. You can see that if you scroll down a little bit lower down page 3 from your 3rd of December email. Yes, you see that. And then at the top of page 2, on page 2, you can see an email of the 12th of December 2013 and your response. And it's quite a long response. I don't want to read it all out to you, but we could look at the first 2 paragraphs. You say the BBA Certificate Para 7.3 refers back to obtaining clarification from yourselves about the use of K15 in a building which exceeds 18 metres in height. As far as I can see, where the building exceeds 18 metres in height, Para 12.7 of ADB2 refers to the need for limited combustibility of all elements of a cladding system, both above and below 18 metres. This includes the insulation, internal lining board, and the external facing material. The exclusions of smaller gasket parts and similar low-risk items. Therefore, the use of a material of limited combustibility for these components will satisfy the requirements of Section 12 of ADB 2 and Part 4. The definition of MOLC is as stated at Table A7 of ADB 2. I'm just pausing there. That's very similar to, if not identical to, what you had in your draft guidance note that you'd circulated the previous month, isn't it?
Yes, it was.
Guidance note. What is what became Technical Guidance Note 18.
Yes, I probably just copied the words.
Yes. And then the next paragraph, in summary, does almost the same thing so far as BS 8414 is concerned, doesn't it? It takes the... You're nodding. You have to say yes. If you mean
Sorry,
yes.
I'm just reading it.
I follow. Just read it through. I mean, it is. I think.
It looks to be the same wording that I used, or very similar. Yes.
Yes. And then you say, as far as I can see, only one test in accordance with BR 135 was carried out using BS 8414 Part 1. As such, the use of K15 as part of any other cladding build-up fixed to the face of a building or for a cladding system fixed to a structural steel frame covered by BS 8414 Part 2 isn't allowable? Question mark. Please could you advise if I've interpreted the requirements wrongly? Now, first, was that the first time that you yourself had contacted Kingspan about these questions?
Yes, it was.
And to your knowledge, was it the first time anybody at NHBC had contacted Kingspan about these questions?
To my knowledge, yes, but I was aware that there had possibly been a meeting in a London office where Kingspan came into the NHBC and talked to the teams, but I wasn't involved in that, and I don't know what was discussed at that meeting. And
presumably, before you wrote this email to the tech line, no one had briefed you about that meeting?
No, they hadn't.
No. Now, we can't find a response that you ever received from Kingspan to this email. Do you recall receiving a response?
No, not to this email. I think I followed it up with another email asking for it to be escalated to their managers. Now,
we can see page 1 of this email run, which is your email the next day, 13th of December 2013, to KIL, copy to Steve Evans, Dave White and Graham Perrier. You see that?
Yes, I can, yes.
And you say, hello, Ben, thank you for your help so far. You see that?
Yes.
What was that? What was the help so far? And who was Ben?
Ben, I believe, was the chap at the Kingspan line that had replied to my first email. He hadn't offered anything. It was just me being polite,
right,
saying, why did you not reply quicker? But to be fair, I think we'd only given them a day by this point.
Yeah. I think all he'd done is given you the BBA certificate, in fact.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
And then you go on to say, I and my managers here at NHBC would very much like to resolve this issue with you as soon as possible. Could I request that you escalate it to your management team with a view to meeting early in the new year between both parties? So that's the escalation you're referring to, I think, is it?
It is, yes. The purpose of this email, Steve said we need to keep on Kingspan to not let this slip and keep on to get a response from them, and hence that was why we wrote this other one. I wrote this other one so soon.
And then you say, unfortunately, given the number of affected projects that NHBC deals with, we feel that we need to start to advise our customers that K15 doesn't comply with the building regulation requirements or the BBA certificate when used on a building in excess of 18 metres high. Now, it's right, I think, that NHBC did not, in fact, start to advise your customers to that effect at that time.
We didn't. The reason I put that sentence in was that I basically knew it would get a response from Kingspan fairly sharply.
And did it?
Yes, it did. We immediately had their management replying back to me.
And it was that then crystallised the meeting in January 2014 that happened next, I think.
I believe so, and reading and hearing what I've heard from Kingspan, I gather that it sort of focused minds in their organisation.
When you met, well, first question, do you remember meeting Kingspan in the January of 2014 following this exchange?
Yes, I can recall the meeting, yes.
Do you remember whether they advised you that you had actually interpreted the requirements the guidance contained in approved document B completely wrongly?
No, I recall from the meeting that when we put all this to them, they didn't disagree with any of it or really deny any of it.
In the light of that, therefore, why didn't you do as you said you would, even if by way of attention-seeking, in the penultimate paragraph in this email, and indeed start to advise your customers that K15 doesn't comply above 18 metres?
It was not that such decisions were not for me to take.
No, but indeed. But do you know why that didn't happen, given that you were at the meeting and involved in the process?
Well, I know by that stage Steve had reviewed the, well, I say Steve, we'd all reviewed the BBA certificate and considered that potentially, or there was a route forward for the acceptability of K15 if, following the wording in the BBA certificate, Kingspan had given their opinion, view, expertise to say that they considered it to be okay.
What was the basis in approved document B whereby a route to compliance with approved document B to satisfy the functional requirement B4 was based entirely on the manufacturer's approval?
It was, I agree, it was not really a very good way of doing it, but at the time it was not unusual for construction companies or anybody that needed guidance to go to the people that had the most knowledge of a product, which in the case of Kingspan, of K15, was Kingspan. So yes, looking back, it doesn't make a lot of sense that you would rely on a manufacturer to tell you a route through, but there was no other body out there with knowledge, particularly of Kingspan K15 or of this type of insulation and how it performed in fire situations. The only people that had in-depth knowledge of that seemed to be Kingspan.
I'm sorry, as the sole, by then formally qualified fire engineer at NHBC, did you tell your bosses that Kingspan, that K15 could not be used above 18 metres in compliance with approved document B, full stop?
We did have that conversation, yes.
And therefore, can you explain why it continued to be used?
By virtue of the BBA certificate.
And did anybody ask you what the basis of reliance solely on the BBA certificate and by that route solely on Kingspan's approval, what the basis of that was in approved document B?
It ran alongside approved document B. It was another route by which building control bodies...
So was it your opinion at the time that even though K15 didn't meet the requirements of approved document B so far as limited combustibility was concerned, and would only meet the requirements of approved document B if contained in a wall build-up precisely the same as that tested in 2005, notwithstanding that, it was all right to continue to approve the use of K15 above 18 metres simply because Kingspan said it was all right?
If it was just Kingspan saying that, we would not have gone with it. It was the fact that the BBA certificate said seek advice from Kingspan, and therefore we felt that, that was an accepted route through to you being able to accept the product.
Did you know at the meeting in January 2014 that the BBA certificate had been amended in the December of 2013?
We did not know that at the time. We found that out some weeks after that meeting, and we were quite annoyed, disappointed that Kingspan, who obviously knew it had been changed, hadn't mentioned it in the meeting with us.
Did it occur to you, given that you were, in your own mind, entirely reliant on Kingspan's say-so and entirely reliant in turn on the fact, as you thought it at the time, that the BBA certificate permitted that approach to go to the BBA and ask them what the basis, what their basis was for allowing K15 above 18 metres simply based on Kingspan's approval?
We didn't think of it at the time.
No, and why not?
Because it didn't seem an unusual situation that you seek advice from the people that had the most knowledge of the product, and that was Kingspan.
Were you aware, in and after October 2013 and before the meeting with Kingspan in January 2014, of any other BBA certificates in relation to other products which said go and seek the manufacturer's approval if you want to use it above 18 metres?
I wasn't aware of any BBA certificates, but typically in the construction industry, take for instance, advice on a cavity barrier in a complex facade. The normal route is that people will go to the manufacturer of cavity barriers and say, I've got this situation, can you give us your advice? And to me, it was just a bit of a follow-on from that, BBA said, well, we've seen some tests, but, if you need more expert advice, specific advice, go to Kingspan for that.
So, going to Kingspan, so what happens to approved document B? You can't satisfy approved document B. You just go to the manufacturer. Manufacturer says it's fine, and up it goes. Was that the approach?
I agree, looking back, that was the approach.
But I don't understand looking back. That was the approach that you must have realised at the time you were taking. And what I'm keen to understand is how you thought that was justified.
Because the BBA certificate said seek advice from Kingspan in use of their product over 18 metres.
In the course of your education to be a fire engineer, were you told that notwithstanding that a particular product did not meet the requirements or the guidance in approved document B, it was perfectly acceptable approach simply to rely without question on a BBA or like certificate?
No, obviously we were never taught that.
No.
But if I could just say, at that first meeting we had with Kingspan, they brought along, I can recall now them saying that, yes, yes, it's a combustible material, but look, here's a video of us firing a blow lamp at it, and as you can see, it doesn't burn particularly. The issue we've got is that we just don't have a great deal of evidence that meets the UK way of doing things, but, again, paraphrase, trust us, we use this a lot on tall buildings around the world, and it's accepted.
And you thought that was an acceptable, independent, robust way of holding Kingspan to account for the use of combustible material above 18 metres?
Not really, no.
So why did you let it continue? I know you say it wasn't your decision. Why did you let your bosses continue to approve K15, given that you knew it was dangerous?
I seem to recall I did on several occasions point out that this was getting flimsier and flimsier. The way, we were accepting this product was just, it was not. The more we got into it, we were not getting a greater feeling of comfort. It just seemed to be getting flimsier and flimsier.
Now, let's then move forward in time, and we'll come back to the BBA certificate in due course, Mr. Lewis. Let's go to NHB 50688. The second email down in the chain at the foot of page 1 is an email of the 2nd of April 2014 from your colleague Dave White to technical services managers, copied to you and Steve Evans and Graham Perrier. Can you see that?
I can, yes.
Yes, it's right at the foot of the page. And if we go over to page 2, please, at the top, you say, he says, I should say, NHBC, we go to the top of page 2, top of page 2 of this email run. Thank you. FYI, to clarify in response to various emails below, First bullet, NHBC had a follow-up meeting with Kingspan today to discuss further testing in relation to fire performance of the K15 insulation board product on walls above 18 metres. Although some additional testing has been recently done, there are still, and this is now in bold, no further reports yet issued to prove performance for a typical multi-storey frame building where the wall build-up includes light gauge stud framing filled with insulation and covered by exterior grade fire-resistant sheathing board onto which K15 is fixed. So to clarify, on the current situation for walls 18 metres and above, and this is in bold, and then this is in cat, only wall build-up for which we have full proof of fire performance of K15 is for a blockwork masonry backing wall, and I'm using a raised voice to indicate the cat, i.e. as described in BRE Fire Test Report 220876 for Kingspan insulation on a multi-storey wall, tested as defined by BR135 and BS 8414 Part 1. This is referred to in BBA Certificate 084582, but may not be absolutely clear from the way it's presented in the current certificate. We plan to review this again with Kingspan pending results from ongoing BRE fire testing in the coming months. Now, you were at that meeting, I think, weren't you?
Sorry, which date was this meeting?
This is early April, 2nd of April 2014.
This was the second meeting we had with Kingspan, yes.
Yes, and you were there, yes?
Yes.
Yes. So do you remember, did you discuss with Kingspan at that meeting the letters that they were providing to the NHBC about K15 on projects over 18 metres, which had been registered before January 2014, based on the BBA certificate?
I can't recall specifically what was discussed, but I'm sure they would have been discussed at that meeting, yes.
Well, we have notes of the meeting, and they're at Appendix A. It's NHB 508853 at page 12. We just quickly look at that. There it is. We've looked at this document, and you can see the meeting is referred to in the second part of the page. What we have, in fact, is what looks like a cut and paste in the 3rd, 4th and 5th bullet points, if we scroll down to the foot of page 2, from the email we've just looked at. And there's no reference to any letters there that they've been providing. Are you sure it's right that, in fact, there was any discussion at that meeting about letters?
I can't recall.
Do you know why it wasn't at this time, given the terms and tenor of the email we've just been looking at, and what one might call the takeaway from this meeting, why it was that NHBC did not simply draw a line under the use of K15 at this point and say, we're not going to approve the use of K15 above 18 metres anymore, unless you provide us with test data for the particular build-up which conforms with BS 8414, either parts 1 or 2, and BR 135.
The reason I believe that it continued was the change had occurred as of 1st of January, 31st of December. That was taken as, NHBC gave that as a cut-off between the old BBA certificate and the new BBA certificate. So the old ones were being dealt with via the letter from Kingspan. The ones after that were the ones where we were seeking the, a more deeper assessment and more clarification on how it could be done. They were schemes for which the initial notice was submitted, and these schemes being as big as they were, we knew that we had several months, year, maybe more, before those schemes came up to the point at which they were asking for a final certificate. And under the building regulations, at the point up until then, is still work in progress. It's not deemed to be compliant or non-compliant. That only, comes to the crunch at the end of the job when the final certificate is being issued. That then, as a regulator, you're committing, that you've assessed it and you consider it to be in compliance with building regulations. So we knew that we had several months of this, we had several months in which Kingspan could come up with a justification to prove it before we were in the situation where we had to nail our colours to the mast, as it were.
I see. Do you remember when you first saw the new BBA certificate and realised that it had been replaced in December 2013?
It was when I believe it was Dave, wasn't it? Dave White sent a copy around. It's just further up on this
Yes.
email that's on here. I think it's in this timeline. If you could just go up.
You're right, it is. That's
Yes.
19th, looks like 19th of March.
Could you just go up another page, please?
Yeah, page 11. Does that help you? It looks like 24th of February 2014. Does that help you?
I'm just reading it. Yes, that would be about right, yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, can we then go back, please, to NHB 50688 and the email at the top of the chain of the 3rd of April 2014. This one is from Philip Pettinger, a Special Projects Manager at NHBC, and he's replying to Dave White's update on the meeting with Kingspan. And he says, without exaggeration, and I should say, I'm sorry, Mr. Lewis, you're sent this email as well as Dave White. You're a direct recipient of it. And he says, without exaggeration, every, underlined and in bold, every building SRPM deal with which are over 18 metres in height, on extremes now pushing 250 metres in height, propose / have used Kingspan K15, and I would guess at 90% or more, in bold, are light gauge steel infill framed walls with either brickwork and or rain screen external cladding. This would include building control jobs also. On warranty only jobs, we are accepting K15 if the building control body is happy and deem it to comply. They always are and do, ! We are adopting the same approach to our own warranty and BC jobs subject to our surveyors. And then this is in bold and in red for emphasis. Just for clarity and to avoid confusion, are our building control teams accepting K15 this for these types of jobs at the moment? It would be good to know, as we get asked by various developers and contractors. This question will come up in a meeting next week for a 75-storey resi building, and suspect it will be the key factor as to whether NHBC undertake the BC or not. However, Tower Hamlets officer John McGeary is also looking at this situation and is fully aware of the issues. Not sure of his decision on though they will be the alternative BC provider. Now, I'm most interested really in the first two paragraphs and the red bold at the beginning of the third. You've addressed this email in your statement, and I'm summarising, Mr. Lewis, so correct me if this is wrong, but you agree, I think, that most buildings were steel framed, but you disagree that every building used K15. That was your position in your statement. Just help us. What type of insulation was predominantly being used on tall buildings, of the kind to which Mr. Pettinger is referring here?
No, the go-to product was Kingspan K15.
Right. Was ACM, were ACM rain screen panels also being routinely used over 18 metres at this time?
Not that I recall, no.
What kind of panels were being used predominantly, or was there no predominant type of panel?
There wasn't really. I mean, at the time, we were... I remember when we did the review in 2015, we were finding a lot of brick facades. We found quite a few solid metal sheet facades. Terracotta was another one that was being used. Various high-pressure laminates, rock panels. There was a range, I mean, and obviously ACMs were in there as well of varying types.
As NHBC specialist fire engineer, would you be consulted on very tall buildings? In other words, buildings pushing 250 metres?
No, not necessarily.
Right. Why is that? Do you know?
Because the SRPM teams were much more knowledgeable of facade systems and cladding systems than I was at that point. My knowledge was very much developing as quickly as I could at this point, and they were dealt with. You know, I was a specialist within the technical services, dealing with a whole range of fire issues, not specifically just dealing with the high-rise. The high-rise tended to be in London, tended to be dealt with by teams that had worked on high-rise for many months, years, and so I wasn't routinely brought in.
Right. Just examining that answer, does that tell us that, in fact, your qualification as a fire engineer, although you had specialist knowledge of fire, what it was, how it grew, how it spread, how it behaved, you didn't have a specialist knowledge of the testing regime, and you weren't a cladding or facade specialist either?
I think that's fair to say.
Right.
I certainly wasn't the facade specialist. I did know probably more about the fire testing than possibly others did in the NHBC at that point.
Were those limitations that you've explained to us about, which surround your expertise as a fire engineer, known to Steve Evans, Diane Marshall, Ian Davis?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Now, the email, as it says, as I've shown you in the middle paragraph, says what it says. I've read it to you. One can read it. Would it be fair to say that while Steve Evans and you had been setting out the guidance for the acceptability of combustible materials, what happens on site is completely different?
Which paragraph are you referring to, sorry?
The middle one.
The one on warranty-only jobs?
Yes. In other words, building control bodies always accept K15 above 18 metres as a matter of practicality, notwithstanding what approved document B says.
That was the feedback that we were getting, was that I wasn't aware of any building control body. I wasn't hearing of any that were kicking it back, as it were. And, you know, we were seeing the jobs from both the warranty side and the building control side. The building control, NHBC probably carried out building control on less than half of the jobs, which to me meant that, you know, over half of the jobs were being dealt with by other building control bodies, and the refusal or the kickback from those building control bodies was not there. I.e., in other words, you know, those other building control bodies, as far as I could see, were accepting it. I mean, I do recall later on some jobs where we did say, you know, are you sure your building control body's got this right? We would receive letters, and we saw letters, you know, very many of them being from LABC, local authorities, saying, you know, we accept the use of Kingspan on this building. We don't have a problem with it. And that was the general way things seemed to be happening at the time.
By this time, though, your knowledge of the acceptability of K15 had evolved so that you were now clear in your mind that it should not be on buildings above 18 metres, save in a build-up that conformed to the 2005 8414 test, yes?
It was, yes.
And therefore, did you not think to yourself that there was a problem out there, of a generic problem with building control, because they were routinely accepting K15 and had historically been doing so on buildings above 18 metres?
Yes. Yes. That would sum it up quite neatly, I would say, yes.
Right, thank you. And what was your reaction when you saw this email? Was it telling you something you knew already, or did it come as a...
There was no surprise in this.
Right.
Apart from, you know, I couldn't say with any certainty that every building, but certainly we knew that an awful lot of them were proposing it.
Right. So would it be fair to describe NHBC's knowledge at this time, early April 2014, as knowledge of mass non-compliance so far as K15 was concerned on high-rise buildings?
Well, it's hard to say it was non-compliance because, as I say, the BBA certificate, it could mean that the other building control bodies, again, were relying on the BBA certificate as the route through to compliance. So I don't think you can say it's non-compliance. Well, possibly you can. I don't know where it legally sits.
Did you ever seek to explore with other building control bodies at this time whether, in accepting K15 above 18 metres before the end of 2013, they had relied solely on the BBA certificate as it then stood, or whether they had any other view or understanding on the basis of which they could accept K15 above 18 metres? Did you do that?
No, we didn't do that.
Why is that?
Really, it was very time pressured at the time. We were, we had a lot of jobs in build at the time, which we knew we had to resolve in some shape or form. And I wasn't just doing claddings, I was doing a lot of other fire-related issues. There was a lot going on at this time.
Well, let's turn now then together to the BBA certificates themselves, given the importance. In relation to K15 first, I think, and then generally. Can we go to your statement, please, at page 15? And if we look at paragraph 61B on that page, we need to scroll down a bit further. We looked at this before, but I'll just look at it again. It says, as of January 2014, when the concerns were being raised, this was when we picked up on the change of wording to the BBA certificate, which stated the need to refer back to the manufacturer. And just pausing there, I think you identified for us the circulation of the BBA certificate at the end of February 2014. But were you aware of the fact of the change before that? Because you identified January there as the date.
The first I knew about it was when Dave sent his email.
I see. So
It may have not been January, it may have been February, I can't recall for sure.
Can you recall whether it was before or after your first meeting with Kingspan?
It was definitely after the first
I
meeting
see,
with
thank you.
Kingspan.
Now, and then goes on. Steve Evans' policy was then to obtain confirmation from the manufacturer for every project, so that BBA certificate requirements would be fulfilled. In this way, the BBA certificate would satisfy the building regulations. Now, on the change of wording, are you referring here to the removal in December 2013, to be precise, the 17th of December 2013, of the subsection in it that said, in buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level, advice should be sought from the certificate holder?
Yes.
Now, we looked at Steve Evans at some examples of the confirmations received from Kingspan. I'm not going to show you the same, but would you agree that they were generic and were not in-depth analyses or scientific examinations for each confirmation?
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah. Now, we can go to it if you want to, but do you remember that the BBA certificate for K15, which was reissued on the 17th of December 2013, removed that clause? So, just to be clear, the policy that Steve Evans wanted confirmation from Kingspan for each build-up was for projects that were registered before January 2014.
That's right, yes.
Right. And do you remember when that policy began? Was it when the NHBC started asking Kingspan for what had been referred to as comfort letters, or another time?
I'm struggling to remember, because I thought Steve sent something out in December 2013 as well, which said I can't recall when it was, whether it was then or whether it was later.
No. He did send something out in December 2013. We're going to come to that, but we need just to. Well, we'll come back to that question perhaps and its answer in due course. But the previous policy, had that been running since the inception of the BBA certificate for K15 in October 2008, when the clause was first put in?
It wasn't a formal policy. I think it was, the general way was that it was considered, K15 was considered to be okay, and when it was looked at why it was considered to be okay, someone would say, well, the BBA certificate says that. So on that basis, I don't think it was really ever challenged particularly. It was taken as being, well, if it's got BBA, go back to Kingspan. I can't speak for everybody in NHBC. I only came across that situation once in 2013 on the job that I mentioned, the St Pancras Way, and all those details were submitted from the contractor, all the stuff from Kingspan saying their reasoning why they considered it to be okay.
At what point, to the best of your recollection, did NHBC cease accepting K15 above 18 metres based solely on Kingspan's say-so?
well, we knew the date was 17th of December 2013. I believe just for ease, they said, well, let's just run that till the end of the year and we'll start from the 1st of January and we'll go from that date. And so that was the cut-off date as to between the old and the new.
Yeah, it was, as we know from Mr. Evans' evidence. But when was that approach, that policy inaugurated? When did that start happening? Wasn't at midnight.
No, it wasn't. It was after them. It was after we seen the new BBA certificate. It would have been after that the policy had to be transmitted to the surveyors that the certificate had changed.
But when after that? How long after that?
I can't recall.
Now, here in your statement you say, in this way the BBA certificate would satisfy the building regulations. We may have covered this before when discussing the approved document giving guidance on Regulation 7, but in what way could a BBA certificate satisfy the building regulations?
It is, as I say,
is it?
Yes.
Right. If we go to page 45 of your statement, paragraph 172A, at the foot of that page you say, the mention of the BCA guidance note was suggested as there were concerns on the wording used in the BBA certificates. I felt that this wording could be heavily influenced by the manufacturers and resulted in confusing or embellished certificates, which, albeit factually correct, sometimes made important information difficult to read. Now, what you're saying here is in the context of a much later exchange. It's the discussions within the BBA, or with the BBA, that NHBC had in November 2015, so almost 2 years later. My question is, when did you yourself first begin to suspect that manufacturers could, as you put it, heavily influence the language of the certificates?
I felt it was telling that the words or the paragraph to refer back to the certificate holder had been removed from the pre-2014 BBA certificate and the post-2014 BBA certificate. To me, that, I guessed that the reason it had been taken out was because BBA were no longer comfortable with that wording being in there, and at their insistence it had probably been removed. Because if Kingspan had been instrumental in it for any particular reason, then I would have expected they would have told us that reasoning at the meeting in January, and they made no mention of it.
No. But when you did discover the change in the certificate, you didn't go straight back to Kingspan and point it out to them and ask them for an explanation as to why they'd kept quiet about it, did you?
I can't remember what we did.
I don't think we've seen any documents that suggest that, and you don't say it in your statement.
No. It would be in the timeline, that it would have said in there as to what emails were sent by who to whom. But I thought NHBC responded to it quite quickly and sent. I can't remember.
Going back to your statement then at page 44, please, if we can, just go back a page to paragraph 170B. You can see that you address the second issue of the BBA certificate for K15, published in December 2013. You see that under B there. And you say this, Little Roman 1, I believe that one of our surveyors, possibly Chris Cooley, brought this certificate to my attention, although I cannot remember the details on how I got involved and when concerns were brought to my attention. I remember that concerns were raised internally about this change as the reference to the certificate holder confirming that the configuration was acceptable was removed. The only route for compliance permitted by the certificate was the single configuration under the BS 8414 test. Our concern was with Kingspan, who only had one BS 8414 test conducted in 2005. It is around December 2013 time that we then started engaging in the dialogue with Kingspan. Having reviewed the evidence given to the inquiry, I've discovered that Kingspan used a different version of K15 during the 2005 test. I was unaware of that at the time. Now, just focusing on the first three Roman numerals there, the clause in the BBA certificate for Kingspan K15 before the December 2013 reissue, in other words, the version issued in 2008 and then 2010 and then again in July 2013, had the advice should be sought from the certificate holder provision in it. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And it didn't say, did it, that the certificate holder could confirm acceptable build-ups over 18 metres? Didn't say that, did it?
It didn't use those words,
No.
but
Do you know why the NHBC, and apparently nobody else, interpreted it that way?
it just simply said, for buildings over 18 metres, seek advice from the certificate holder.
Yes, but it doesn't say that the certificate holder could say yes or no to whether the build-up over 18 metres was acceptable. So my question is, why did NHBC interpret it that way?
We just took the assumption that we took the assumption because it had been tested for a configuration,
Yeah.
and therefore we thought, well, it possibly can be used on high-rise. The BBA, like I say, there was the 8414 test, there was the video with the blow lamp. You know, at the time, it was not ringing alarm bells with us that this was a product which was a massive risk on tall buildings. It was more that, and you know, with the assurances and comforting words from Kingspan, that it was just a matter of proving the compliance. It obviously was going to be okay, but this is the Kingspan's words, they felt it was going to be okay, but it was just a matter of they didn't have the paperwork to back that up. And hence why Kingspan said, please bear with us, we can't get the paperwork overnight, it takes time to do these tests, bear with us a little bit, we'll get it together, and then everyone will be happy. And that was the how things were left really at that time.
Right. Let's just focus, though, on the words in the BBA certificate. And bear in mind, as you've told us, that the BBA certificate was, as you thought, justified as reliable, so far as the NHBC was concerned, by approved document B, and that therefore the phrase advice should be sought from the certificate holder was something the NHBC could rely on. Now, given that you knew that it wasn't a material of limited combustibility, and given that you knew it had only passed one very specific full system build-up, my question is, well, what advice did you think Kingspan would be giving to a building owner seeking approval, or to a building control officer asking the question, other than, yes, this is exactly the same as tested in 2005, or no, this is not exactly the same? What other advice could Kingspan give that sat within approved document B?
There wasn't really any advice that sat within approved document B. I do recall on a scheme before this where the contractor had gone to Kingspan, and the paperwork that came back from Kingspan was, in their words, I seem to recall, it said along the lines of, we tested it to 8414 part 1 and we used a very thin panel as representing worst case conditions, and therefore, given that it passed on this type of test, they were comfortable that it would pass on other forms. And their emails and response back would be along those lines, indicating that they'd thought carefully, and whereas we realised afterwards that the 8414 test from 2005 was actually on quite a robust construction, Kingspan were putting it forward as that it was, quite a weak construction, and therefore, if it passed that one, then anything else would many other types of cladding would also perform okay.
Did you ever ask yourself the question, when you saw this BBA certificate and realised that it was being relied upon to justify the use of K15 above 18 metres, did you ever ask yourself the question, What advice is it that Kingspan would be giving?
No, it didn't.
Did it not occur to you, leave aside whether or not the BBA certificate was the route, did it not occur to you that going to a manufacturer and asking them, is this okay above 18 metres, was not a route to compliance with ADB?
Well, as I say, the BBA certificate gave the indication that you did go back to Kingspan and seek specialist advice from them, then, you know, that you would end up with a safe build-up.
Did you ask yourself the question, I wonder where BBA have got the idea from that asking the manufacturer for whether or not its own combustible material can be used above 18 metres comes from?
Well, I kind of felt that Kingspan must have influenced the wording to get that in there. But equally, on the other side, I felt that it wasn't that unusual, as I said earlier, to go back to a manufacturer for specialist advice on their product.
Well, that might depend on the nature of the specialist advice you're seeking, but on what basis did you think Kingspan could tell you that K15 was suitable for use over 18 metres if it didn't satisfy the requirements of ADB? I mean, what was the thinking, to your understanding, going on at Kingspan?
The thinking was it was not very rigorous thinking, but it was surely Kingspan, they sell this all over the world, they put it on lots of high-rise buildings, they must know that it's safe. It was that sort of a thinking.
Well, it's safe because they think it's safe.
Unfortunately, yes.
Not because of any testing or analysis or...
No, it was coupled with, it has passed some testing for use on high-rise. And that was, and like I say, with other things mixed in there as well. Don't forget that we also, like I say, the blow lamp test, we didn't place any reliance on the LABC approvals, but we knew that they had also looked at it and come up with some consideration that it was safe. It didn't strike us that, the whole thing was pointing to everybody in the industry seemed to think it was basically a fairly safe product. And we, rightly or wrongly, went along with that, really. We didn't scrutinise that to a much greater level of depth.
Right, thank you.
You were aware, I think, from what we've seen, October, certainly November 2013, of a BR 135 third edition, yes?
Yes.
You would therefore have been aware, is this right, that within the appendices to BR 135, Appendix A dealing with masonry, Part 1, and Appendix 2 dealing with steel structured frames, Appendix B, both of those had a paragraph in them, the gist of which was that the results of a BS 8414 Part 1 or Part 2 test could only be used to justify the inclusion of any of those components in exactly the same wall build-up, yes?
Yes.
And therefore, in order to justify the use of K15 in any build-up other than that which had been tested in 2005, as referred to in the BBA certificate that had run until December 2013, you would have needed to see as many different as many different BS 8414 tests passing BR 135 as there were build-ups out there, yes?
Yes.
Did you ask to see all the many thousands of, or at least hundreds, of BR 135 criteria satisfied under BS 8414 tests that surely must have existed if Kingspan were to be believed?
We did ask Kingspan for their tests. They produced only that one.
Only one, and yet there were many, as we've seen from the Pettinger email, many, use a very neutral word there, many high-rise buildings with Kingspan K15 on them. Did it occur to you that at that time, either that Kingspan had radically misunderstood, whether deliberately or otherwise, the provisions of 8414 BR135 and the alternative route to compliance, or that you were going along with that misunderstanding by permitting that situation to remain.
Sorry, I lost track of the question.
Well, let me try it more simply. Once it had become apparent to you that they could only produce one set of test results, it must have been clear to you that there were simply no test results supporting the many different build-ups that contain K15 out there.
Yes, that became very clear to us.
And when did that become very clear to you?
Well, it was very clear after the first meeting with Kingspan when we realised they only had that one test.
Right. And why at that point did you not then bring down the shutters and say no more K15 above 18 metres until you've got a test for that build-up or that build-up or that build-up?
Because Kingspan said, we've got all these tests booked on all these different materials. Just give us a few weeks, we'll have the evidence for you and everything will be fine.
What, to justify the historic position?
Well, to justify that it was its use on all these various different types of cladding.
So were you expecting to see hundreds, if not thousands, of BS 8414 tests?
We weren't expecting that many, but we did expect, 5 or 6 more tests on a bigger range of materials.
Do you accept this proposition as a matter of common sense, that buildings on whose initial notice was served before the 31st of December 2013 were no more or less safe than buildings in respect of which the notice was served on or after the 1st of January 2014?
I accept that, yes.
Yes. And you accept, I suppose, also that the combustibility of K15 was the same either at 10 to midnight or 10 past midnight on the 1st of January 2014.
Yes, I accept that, yes.
Therefore, why did the fact that there had previously been an unreliable and unsafe BBA certificate, as you came, no doubt, to see that it was, mean that history should continue to be repeated?
I have no answer. I mean, I was just one of a group of people that were looking at this issue at the NHBC. I gave my views on the fire aspect of it. The rest was really for others to decide upon.
Now, let's look a little bit more closely at the guidance given to NHBC staff over the BBA certificate. And you referred earlier in your evidence to an email in December 2013. I just want to look at that. NHB 50615, please. 615. And if we go to page 2, we can see that this is an email at the bottom of the chain, first one, 2nd of December, from Steve Evans to you. Use of Kingspan Cool Foam K15 rain screen board. Hi, John. You see that?
Yes.
Hope that you had a good weekend. I'm proposing to send the email below to all technical staff today, as this was discussed at length at the managers' meeting. Any comments? And the text says, "Dear all," in italics. There has recently been some confusion in respect of the use of Kingspan Cool Foam K15 rain screen board in buildings over 18 metres in height. The confusion has arisen in respect of whether the material can be treated as a material of limited combustibility. The product has a current BBA certificate attached which indicates that it is acceptable for use in accordance with Approved Document B, Volume 2, Paragraph 4.7, 7.1, and the 7.1 is the provision in the certificate. The BBA certificate does seem to qualify this, however, by then going on to say that in situations over 18 metres, advice should be sought from the certificate holder, 7.2. We're currently investigating this with Kingspan and we are awaiting a response from them. However, until we are in a position to say otherwise, NHBC's BCS's current policy is to accept the use of this material in rain screen and masonry construction over 18 metres. And if we go to the next email up in the chain to page 1, we can see your response the same day, 2nd of December 2013, and you say this: "Hello, Steve. I'm not too sure about this one. I think it would be better to wait until Kingspan clarify things, ? I don't agree that there's confusion about the MOLC classification. This type of insulation board is combustible and doesn't meet the MOLC classification. BBA Certificate Para 7.1 is referring to its Class 0 rating, not its LC, limited combustibility, properties. It's badly worded, but I still don't think it implies that K15 is a MOLC. Para 7.2 states that reference needs to be made back to Kingspan before accepting it in a building over 18 metres. So, if we send out an email to all staff, I think we should state that whilst we are obliged to accept it in principle, it is a requirement of the client to obtain this advice from Kingspan and present it to us before we can formally accept it in the situation proposed. And then there's a bit of text set out, which I think you've drafted, yes? Underneath that.
I think
Or amended.
Yes.
Then if we go to page 2, you can see that then ends, and then you go on to say, the trouble is that I don't think Kingspan will be able to come up with the required goods, ! But at least we've dug into it a bit deeper. Now, first, if we just could go back up, please, to page 1, where you say we're obliged to accept it in principle. You see that?
Yes.
Why were NHBC obliged to accept K15 in principle? What was the principle?
It comes back to the fact that there is a BBA certificate that says on a taller than 18-metre building, seek advice back from the certificate holder. That, to me, in a way, suggested that we were kind of maybe obliged is not the right wording, but it was going to be very difficult for us to refuse it, to accept it, if there was a BBA certificate that indicated a route to compliance and accepting it.
But it didn't indicate a route to compliance. That's the problem, isn't it? It was indicating a route, but not to one which was sanctioned by approved document B.
No, but we took it. Everybody, I believe, at the time that read that took that as indicating that that was the basis on which it could be accepted.
Did you think at the time that the BBA had got this right or got this wrong when saying that, although it's not a MOLC, seek advice from the manufacturer if you wish to use K15 above 18 metres?
Again, as I said earlier, it didn't seem out of the question that you would go back to a manufacturer for specific advice on their product. With that, you would be expecting that the manufacturer was, giving good advice.
Were you not interested to... Sorry, I'm so sorry. Did you want to complete your answer?
No, I was just saying, you would expect... It was possibly a misguided, way of doing things, but... the assumption, rightly or wrongly, was that the manufacturer would know the most about the product and be able to advise on its best use.
And again, the answer may be the same, but let me just try it anyway. Do you accept that, according to approved document B, you were obliged, in fact, to refuse approval to K15 precisely because it was neither a material of limited combustibility nor being used in a cladding system tested under B8414 and certified to BR135?
It was not, as I've said, it was not as clear-cut as that because you had the BBA certificate and then within the ADB you then had the extended application routes.
Right, so at this point, this precise point, December 2013, why not then go to the BBA and say, we have this certificate, it's got this provision in it, can you please explain what the basis of your putting that in there was? Why didn't we know you didn't do that at that stage, and indeed not for a long time afterwards? Why is that?
For me, I was looking more at the fire, technical aspects of things. I didn't have roots into BBA. I didn't know who they were, and I was amongst me, Steve, Graham, I was, junior to them. So things like that I would have left to them to do.
And you say at the end of this, as I've shown you, at least we've dug a bit deeper. What did you mean by that?
Could you go back to that?
Yes, of course. Page 2. You're quite right. No, absolutely. Page 2. After the text, you say, the trouble is I don't think Kingspan will be able to come up with the required goods, but at least we've dug into it a bit deeper.
Could you just go up the page a little bit more, please?
Back to page 1.
Yes, yeah. I just can't remember. 1 second if I read it, please.
Yes, of course.
I think what I meant by that was, we were now routinely on every job from here on going to go back to Kingspan and say, we want to see your advice, please, Mr. Kingspan, for this particular job and the cladding systems on it, and be very specific. And that was, what I meant by us. We were going to dig a bit deeper on job specific, on each job.
But unless you got test data which passed or satisfied the requirements of BR 135, they were never going to be able to satisfy you, were they?
Not following approved document B route, no.
Well, there's no other route, is there?
Well, as I said in that last paragraph, I didn't think they were going to be able to come up with anything.
Exactly. So at that point, having dug as far as you had by this stage, why not simply, by this time, say to Kingspan, no?
That was not for me as in my position to do.
I understand that, but why? Can you explain why your seniors didn't?
Well, as I say, there was this long period of time before it was going to... Sorry, no, let me think again, because this was before that change in the Kingspan in the BBA certificate.
Yes. And at this time, I think it's right to say you didn't actually know that there was even going to be a change.
We didn't. Sorry, Mr. Mills, could you repeat your question again?
Well, my question really is, although it wasn't your position to make policy decisions, why did your seniors not at this point say no to Kingspan? No K15 above 18 metres?
I don't know. I would guess that we needed to... There was definitely going to be a big knock-on effect, to suddenly pull the rug from the acceptance of Kingspan was going to leave, at this time, just before the end of a year, was going to leave an awful lot of buildings that could not complete in time, for the end of the year, and that was a cut-off date in most house builders' diaries, people wanting to move in by Christmas. It would have had a massive knock-on effect across the industry. And I think that had to be handled very carefully, and that was what my managers were aware of, was that had to be handled in a careful way. I repeat again, that we were, in probably less than half the cases, the building control body on these jobs. So we would have been the only ones going and saying it's clearly wrong when other building control bodies and, again with the LABC certificate, were saying, no, it's actually fine. And that was going to be a very difficult situation to justify, that it would have been very difficult to justify in that way.
Let's look at the certificate, BBA 6037. If we go to the first page at the bottom, we can see in the light grey box that it's signed off, you see that, on the 27th of October 2008. And then there's some very small text underneath that says certificate amended on 6th of April 2010. And this certificate was then itself published on the 12th of July 2013 and still current at the time of these emails. As you've just told us, you weren't aware of the imminent change. If we go to page 5, we can see clause 7.2 and the seek approval wording. There it is. And if we go up to 7.1, you can see that K15, it's classified as class 0 or low risk. You see that?
Yes, I can see that.
And you pointed that fact out to Steve Evans, I think, in your email.
Yes.
If we look at the second paragraph, it says that in England and Wales, K15 can be used in accordance with a number of parts of ADB, including 12.7. Do you see that?
Yes, indeed.
When did you first notice the presence of the reference to 12.7 in this certificate?
I believe it was the sequence of events was I wrote to the Kingspan Helpline asking for their reasons why they considered it acceptable. They wrote back to me and they enclosed a BBA certificate, which was the 2008 version, which didn't have that reference into it. Then in the subsequent email discussion between me and Steve, he wrote, that Steve had then downloaded from the BBA certificate's website this version. Now, I took a cursory look at what Steve had emailed and didn't, at that point, realise that it was a different version to the one that I'd already looked at, which did not say the 12.7 thing.
I see.
So when I replied back to Steve's email about, I don't think there's any confusion, blah, 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 I hadn't noticed that there was this other certificate that had this wording on it. So it would have come out, I guess, after Steve obviously wondered why we were talking at cross purposes and pointed it out at that point.
I see. I follow. And this would have been, because I think we saw you going to the helpline on the 26th of November 2013, this would all have been within the same
This was all at that same
within
time.
a few days.
Yes, this was all happening quite rapidly, and
Yes.
this is just one email I looked at briefly and commented.
Right. Did you...
Sorry, could I just point... another of our issues with the BBA certificates were that they were quite confusingly worded, such as if you go to the first page of this one...
Yes. Can we do that, page 1, please?
You would expect... Sorry, the second page, please, if may.
Page 2. Right. Page 2.
Well, just whilst looking at page 1, behaviour in relation to fire. The builds will not contribute to the development stages of a fire. Yeah, that to your average building control officer, I say average, I don't mean it disrespectfully, but to most building control people, they'd think, well, that means it's not going to make a fire worse, so it's pretty good. You would also look at this section here under regulations. It gave text about fire performance, and yet Regulation B4 or any Regulation B is not cited in that area there about all this lot. So it was all very confusing that they had this, acceptance via the Regulation 7, and yet this front page didn't indicate it being a big risk, and the regulation section not really specifically saying yes or no towards Regulation B.
Yeah. And what you've just told us, were those thoughts that you had at the time when you first saw the BBA certificate, whether it had come from Kingspan or whether it had come from the website?
Well, these were thoughts I had about BBA certificates, which probably not at that time, but, as I read them more and more later on,
Right.
you started to feel that you had to read between the lines a little bit on a BBA certificate because the wording could be quite confusing.
Well, we need to be careful, Mr. Lewis, not to confuse your thoughts at the time, which I'm interested in, with your opinions about the document which evolved later and perhaps during the process of preparing to give evidence. At the time, late November, early December 2013, did you espouse the views about this BBA certificate then that you're now telling us about?
I can't recall that I did specifically, no.
No.
But I did certainly look at, I was only asked by Steve really about the refer back to the certificate holder.
Indeed. Do you remember whether before you responded to Steve Evans' 2nd of December 2013 email, you had noticed the presence of the reference of 12.7 there on page 5?
I hadn't noted that at all. I didn't notice that until I think Steve pointed it out to me after he sent me that draft of that email to consider.
Okay, but at that point you noticed it?
Well, he pointed it out to me, and I thought, well, it's obviously incorrect because
Right.
it is it's not a material limited combustibility.
Indeed. And given that 12.7 had somehow got into this certificate, did that not alert you to the fact that this was, at least in that respect, an unreliable document?
Well, I put it down as to being a typo. It didn't necessarily mean that the whole certificate was unreliable, but clearly it had missed something in the final proofread.
Well, it's missed something. It had obtained something, and something pretty dramatic in the final proofread.
I can't recall, though, if there was text in this one about the combustibility classification, though.
Well, if we just go back to page 5, rather than arguing about its words, my question is this, quite simply. When it says in 7.1, approved document B, paragraphs 12.5, 12.6, and 12.7, when you did notice that because Steve Evans had brought it to your attention, did it not occur to you that's an obvious error?
Yes, it would have done. Yes.
And did you not therefore think to yourself, I wonder how that obvious error could have got into this document?
I didn't question it in that way. No, I just assumed that it was a typo.
Right.
Looking at it now, I can see that there is no reference anywhere else or in this area about it not being a material of limited combustibility.
Exactly. And therefore, did it not occur to you at the time that this document was an extremely dangerous one?
It didn't occur to me at the time, no.
Can you explain why that is?
No, because, well, as I say, we were focused more on the 7.2 issue. That was where we were looking as to, well, if it was suitable over 18 metres, what did you need to do to get this advice, and what advice, were we looking for?
But given the fundamental nature of the error of presenting K15 as a material of limited combustibility, as this certificate does, I just want to know why it is you didn't contact either Kingspan or the BBA to ask them how this error had arisen.
At the time, I think I was focused on other things. I don't know. I did not do it.
We'll come back to the BBA certificates. Mr. Chairman, is this a convenient moment?
If it suits you, yes,
does.
certainly. Well, we're going to have another break now, Mr. Lewis. We'll come back, please, at 25 to 4. And again, I must ask you not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it while you're away from the room. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 4, please. Would you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Lewis.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lewis, I want now to turn to the new certificate. We saw that I told you, I think, that on the 17th of December 2013, the BBA certificate changed, so far as K15 was concerned, and deleted the contact the manufacturer clause, clause 7.2, and also the clause indicating that it complied with 12.7. Can we look then, in the light of what I've just said to you, at NHB 50689? This is an email string in February 2014, and if we look at page 2, we can see Steve Evans' email to you on the 25th of February 2014. And let's just look at that. He says, John, missed you off the circulation list for some reason, even though I've asked you to do something. Dave is off till Thursday, so it may be wise to source the BBA yourself. And if you look below that at what is sent, this is on page 3, at the top of page 3, you can see that Steve Evans is asking Dave White to forward a copy of the BBA certificate that you've referred to in the memo. And the memo is something we saw earlier with all the bold and capital letters. So this prompts the BBA certificate as revised to get circulated. What he's asking you to do is to assess the BBA certificate against our BC policy as set out in my email of the 27th of January 2014. Yes? Mm-hmm. You then respond at the top of the chain, bearing in mind the date of the question, 25th of February. The top of the chain is your response on the 9th of May 2014. Do you see that? And you say, hello, Steve. I've taken a look at the current BBA certificate. The relevant bit is extracted below. And we'll come to the rest of this email in a moment. But first, do you know why it took you 2.5 months or so to respond to his request?
No, I don't. I don't recall. It was unusual because we were generally quite quick on this thing, and Steve was always chasing me for things.
Right. Can you explain why this did not conform to the usual way of things?
I can't. I don't recall.
We can see that you go on here to set out the behaviour in relation to fire, part 8. Extracting from the BBA certificate, and it lays out the detailed build-up from the successful BS 8414 test in 2005. You can see that at 8.2.
Yes.
And then you also transpose into your email the little footnote at the bottom in the smaller print, which says the test result relates only to this specific construction, and a separate test would be required to establish the performance of any other combination of materials. And then underneath that, 8.3, which says that the product incorporated in the construction defined in section 8.2 can be used in buildings with a floor more than 18 metres above ground level. Fire breaks should be used at every floor level after the first floor. And then you say this, I'm not actually sure how we can justify accepting it, ! Even the bit about an assessment by Kingspan has been removed, and the words now say that any other combination of materials needs a separate test, and the test is to BS 8414 Part 1, which is specific to masonry walls. We can't see a response to that email from Steve Evans. Do you remember, did he agree with your assessment?
I can't recall. I mean, by the time we got to May, things had moved on again, I believe, I recall that.
Do you know why it took until February 2015, as we'll come to see, for NHBC to change its policy about the acceptance of K15, and only to accept it if the initial notice had been lodged before the 31st of December 2013?
Well, in the interim period of time, we were hopeful that Kingspan would come up with a bulk of evidence which would show that actually their product was okay with the myriad of different cladding facades it was used for. And that period of time just seemed to just keep dragging on. We thought we were at the end of it, and they would ask for a bit longer, and we thought we were getting closer, and it never came. And I think that was, yes, it took till 2015 before the decision makers at NHBC decided that, enough was enough.
As the resident fire engineer, at least say people thought you were, at NHBC, why were you happy to keep accepting K15 in build-ups that had not been tested to 8414?
Because I think by this stage we were asking for, the equivalent of the option 3 assessment. I don't think we'd quite published it by this stage, but, we were asking for that third-party extended application report, I believe.
Right. When did that start? That policy or process?
Well, I thought that Steve's email to the surveyors, once we found out about the change in the Kingspan certificate, and then I think he made a distinction between the pre-31st of the 12th, 2013 and the post ones. And I recall there was an email, I thought it was in February, saying from here on we want any build-up from new schemes to be justified to, by Kingspan or under an extended application.
Right. So, leaving aside the precise chronology, is it the case then that a policy had begun to take root within NHBC of accepting desktops done by reputable test houses in respect of particular build-ups using K15 over 18 metres?
I believe that was in place for the schemes where the initial notice had been served after 31st of December 2013. We were not seeing many because those schemes were in their infancies and getting around to designing the cladding packages generally hadn't happened by that point.
But does it come to this, that those initial notices that had been received before the 1st of January 2014, which included K15 above 18 metres, would be accepted with no further questions asked, simply because of the historic BBA certificate?
It was along those lines. I don't know if I can't recall if we were asking those people to go back and get... Yes, I believe we were asking those designers to go back to Kingspan and ask for, something, the advice from Kingspan that was cited in the BBA certificate.
And what was that advice that you saw?
It tended to be, a letter from Kingspan giving their opinion that they considered it to be okay in the build-up that it was proposed.
But as we discussed earlier, not a reasoned or a detailed analysis featuring an examination of the precise build-up, the products used, the materials used, the orientation.
I agree, it was not an extended application in the terms that you would expect for a PFPF test now.
I want to ask you about Celotex next, and we'll come back to Kingspan. But you say in your statement that you disagreed that K15 was being used on every building over 18 metres, but PIR was being used. And we can look at the statement if you like. But when you refer to PIR, what were you referring to?
We were really we were talking about this family of insulations that included phenolic, PIR and PUR insulations.
I see. Let's look at your statement, please, page 30, paragraph 107. And you say in the middle there, my knowledge of the Celotex RS5000 product was that it was in the same product family as K15, PIR and PUR insulation. I cannot recall for certain when it came to my attention. We did not go into the same level of depth as for K15 because it was much less common for builders to use this product. Was Philip Pettinger right then when he said in April 2014, as we've seen, that buildings over 18 metres were using K15?
It was the go-to product as far as I knew. I just wasn't in a position to verify what Phil said.
Were you aware that Celotex was contacting NHBC in 2014 asking for advice on their standards in order for them to tailor their testing for RS5000 under BS 8414?
I can't recall. If I did know about that, then it would have been, over the coffee discussions with Dave in the Milton Keynes office.
I see. You weren't involved in that?
I wasn't involved in those, no.
Right.
No.
Let's see how we go then with this. Let's look at NHB 50748. This is an email chain from August 2014, at a time, and I say this very generally, when RS 5000 was launched, having apparently passed a BS 8414 test to BR 135 on the 2nd of May 2014. That's the history. It's a long chain. We need only, I think, go to the third email down on page 2, please, if we do that. This is from Steve Evans to Dave White, Graham Perrier, and you. You see, 8th
Yes.
of August. And he says, "Hi all, Noel has found this product. We can't find a BBA certificate at present, but it claims to have had a test making it suitable over 18 metres, although I suspect this is the same as K15, only in the configuration tested." And you then respond, if we scroll up, please, to the top of, well, I think we need the bottom of page 1, top of page 2. Bottom of page 1, your response, 12th of August. And if we go to the top of page 2, you say, "The most noticeable thing is the use of non-combustible fire cement panels on the external face, but at least so they claim it's tested on a steel supporting structure and not a masonry wall. I guess that's a step forward from the situation with K15. Why was that so noticeable?
Which aspect? The test on this steel supporting structure or the use of the non-combustible fire cement panels?
Well, you say the most noticeable thing is the use of non-combustible fire cement panels on the external face. Why was that so noticeable?
Because it was obviously, well, we were likening it to the K15 2006 test, where they used quite big, thick, robust external panels, which we were suspected were to assist it to get through the 8414 test.
Right. So you're referring to the Marley Eternit panels?
Yes.
You may not have known that that's what they were, but that's what you were referring to. The
Yes.
rain screen, effectively.
Yes.
Right. But it was noticeable to you because it was thick and non-combustible, yes?
Yes, we seemed to be just going down the same route that we'd gone down with the K15 2006 test.
Right. And the step forward was that it was on a steel supporting structure and not a masonry wall.
Yes.
And at the very top of the chain, we can see Dave White responds to you and those on the chain. And he says, "Hello, John. Graham and I are currently reviewing a fire test report and supporting information provided by Celotex for this product. We recently had a meeting at their factory premises and have since received a final version of the BRE fire test report. However, the sample test as reported was a wall type with very robust construction, i.e. the thickest boards were specified for both the rain screen and a fire-resistant magnesium oxide backing board fixed as sheathing behind the Celetex insulation product. I think that once we've had time to look at this in standards and technical, it would be useful to discuss this with you and Steve. Meanwhile, if you want to read the report, just let me know, and I will forward it to you. We should deal with the fire test information as commercial in confidence at the moment." Did you read the BRE fire test report? Do you recall?
I recall it was sent to me, I think, by Nigel Edson in a separate email, but it would have been around about this time, because I think as soon as it was released, they put it out there.
Yes. It's certainly correct. You are right as a matter of chronology that it was. My question is, did you actually read it?
Yes, I did.
Having read it, did you notice within the report, the BRE report, a photograph of some white boards, which are in fact white magnesium oxide boards, behind the cladding panels at 2 points on the rig?
I noticed that there was a photograph with orange boards and white boards.
Did you wonder what they were?
I just assumed that these were samples that were left over. The colour didn't matter in a fire test, so they just used these boards because they were, no point throwing them away. I didn't read anything more into it than that.
Right. Did you have any discussions within NHBC about what those boards might be?
No.
Or whether or not the description in the BRE report for RS 5000 2nd of May test accurately listed the components?
No, I mean, I looked at it, I looked as closely as I could. I didn't notice anything untoward in any of the test.
Now, I want to show you NHB 50784. This is an extract from Dave White's review of the fire test report and his subsequent correspondence with John Roper at Celotex. And this is the letter of the 29th of September 2014 that the panel may recall having been shown in the autumn of 2020. And if we go to page 2, we can see in the first paragraph that Dave White writes this. At our previous meetings, I took care when explaining the limitations in testing fire performance of any wall type, where the key details were not representative of typical actual facade systems. This included some constructive feedback on your initial prototype drawings. However, when we finally saw that the actual test had included some very large format thick cladding boards and unusual detailing, the immediate comment was that this test installation was not sufficiently representative of typical rain screen designs normally found on high-rise residential buildings. Whilst this arrangement was resistant to early temperature rise within upper storey levels, the overall fire behaviour indicated that the facade had only limited fire resistance and continued to burn extensively in excess of 30 minutes. First, do you know what the unusual detailing was that he's referring to there?
No, I knew that Dave was somewhat annoyed that, having sat with Celotex to discuss what they were going to test, and Dave had said, test something which actually gets built. And I know that Dave was quite annoyed when the test came in and they used a build-up which was not really seen very often. I don't know what unusual detailing Dave was referring to, though.
Right. Did you agree that the build-up that Celetex tested was not representative of a typical rain screen design?
I did at the time, but I'm struggling now to remember what the whole build-up was.
Right. Well, I don't think I need to spend time listing it for you. But do you remember... well, let's go over the page and look at the third paragraph from the bottom. He says, in terms of NHBC acceptance, our technical view is that the fire performance of Celotex insulation shows limitations in the actual fire resistance, relying heavily on a specific and unusual facade construction type, including thickness and layout of key parts of the cladding system to provide partial fire resistance. Just stopping there. Did you discuss this test with Dave White? Do you remember?
We did discuss it, yes.
Did he talk about, or did he mention his concerns to you that he's expressing here?
I understood that it was Dave's concerns were the fact that the cementitious, the Ethernet panel was such a thick panel, and we never really saw that used very often.
Did you agree with his view that the build-up tested did not represent those used on real-life buildings?
Well, I mean, it could have been used. It wasn't one that we saw used very regularly, and it certainly wasn't a test carried out on, in the worst case, as it were.
After the BS 8414 test for RS 5000 in 2014, do you remember whether the NHBC witnessed a rise in the use of RS 5000 in external wall build-ups on buildings over 18 metres in height?
Not that I recall, no.
Now, I want to ask you then about Technical Guidance Note 18, Issue 0, published in June 2014. If we go to that, please, it is at NHB 50760. And we can see it there on your screen. Use of combustible cladding materials on residential buildings. It's a document we've seen a number of times. It contains a number of options on page 2. If you just go to that. Option 1. And option 1 is taken verbatim, I think, from your original draft note that you'd circulated in November 2013 and had amended slightly by Steve Evans following the meeting that you'd had with Wintec in that month. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Option 2 is a slightly expanded version of the same, isn't it?
Yes, that looks to be...
In the sense that, I say slightly expanded, it's got an add-on at the end. The last sentence of option 2 says these acceptance criteria are listed in Annex A or Annex B of BR 135 and include the following. And then you've got the 3 bullet points: external, internal, and mechanical. Those reflect, don't they, the 3 bullet points that one would see if one looked at BR 135, 3rd edition, Appendix A for masonry and Appendix B for structural steel frame. Yes?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. And then we have option 3. Let's look at that. If no actual fire test data exists for a particular system, the client may instead submit a desktop study report from a suitable independent UCAS-accredited testing body, BRE Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire, stating whether, in their opinion, BR 135 criteria would be met with the proposed system. The report should be supported by test data which the test house already has in its possession, and so this option may not be of benefit if the products have not already been tested in multiple situations or arrangements. The report should also specifically reference the tests which they've carried out on the product. Now, if we go back to your statement, look at that. We will come back to this text if we need to. Go please to page 35 in your statement, paragraph 133. At the bottom of that page, you there set out the constraints on builders testing every build-up scenario to BR 135. And then in the penultimate sentence of that paragraph, you say this, 4 lines up from the bottom: driven by increasing thermal insulation targets, builders were often looking for thinner insulation products, as well as more cost-effective solutions than using such materials. We wanted to document another option available to them if they could not comply with the first 2 options. I therefore drafted option 3. Now, who is the we that wanted this further option? We wanted to document another option.
It would have been, well, it would have been at least myself and Steve.
Anybody else?
Well, myself and Steve were the ones dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. I know Diane and others were being kept abreast of it, but
Right.
generally it was me and Steve working our way through this one.
Right. Why? Why did you want to document another option?
Because we were aware of, to do the option 2, to get the test, it was, A, it took a long time to get a test done, and B, it was only valid for the exact system that was tested. So any change to that system officially meant that that test was null and void. And yet we knew about the extended application route, and so we included it for that reason.
But what was in it for NHBC in doing that?
Just that we knew it was an accepted route. Sorry, we knew that it had been, by virtue of the first meeting with Wintec, we knew it had been suggested by them that it could be done, and by reputable organisations that could do it. We knew that that route was a route supported through ADB, and so, we didn't have a problem with including it, and this was a guidance note for the building control profession. We weren't doing it for our own purposes because it was going out across the board, so it just showed a route forward.
I'm interested in what you say there when you say it was a guidance note for the building control profession and it was going out across the board. I think Steve Evans's evidence, and forgive me for misquoting him, perhaps, is that this was actually a guidance note for BCA members. But do I take it from your answer that actually its influence would have been universal within the building control profession?
Yeah, our understanding was BCA was not restricted in who it would have in there, and it did cover. Right. It certainly covered ACAI members and LABC members, and that pretty much, summed up every building control body.
Right. Why was it NHBC's task, or NHBC's task via the BCA, to help the profession, as you call it, find other ways of complying with the guidance in ADB other than option 1 or 2?
It wasn't really finding other ways. It was, in a way, just, expanding, elaborating, clarifying what was already a way that was accepted under ADB.
Well, Mr. Lewis, that's not how it reads, is it? And what you said is we wanted to document another option, implying that you were not satisfied with the first two and you were looking for a third. And Council's question is, why were you looking for a third?
Because we knew that option 2, to be able to come up with a test. Sorry, I'm not reading this very well. Option 2 was so specific to the actual build-up, and there were many different components in a cladding system, and any change of those components would have, pushed it outside of the option.
So option 2 was of relatively limited value.
Well, it gave a good indication that that type of product used with that type of product used with that type of barrier probably would be all right.
Yeah.
But that wasn't sufficient, to under option 2. That then would need assessment, ideally by somebody more expert, to say, yeah, change that one for that and it'll still work.
Well, I mean, option 2, as you rightly say, is requires a specific test of the wall as it's intended to build it.
Yes.
Yes. So that's going to be expensive and time consuming.
Yes.
So, all right, you're thrown back to option 1. Why isn't that left enough?
Because it was all back to that very, we knew that these option 3 reports could be done. And at the time, we weren't being told or weren't thinking that the insulation was the big fire risk that possibly it was. It was all down to, we kind of felt that, it could be shown to be compliant, and then we could get to a situation, the building control industry could get to a situation where, it was known that these generic types of products worked all right together, in whatever situation, and that was where we were trying to get to with it. We didn't want to hold up the industry. We were aware that insulation, the need to use high levels of insulation to achieve other Part L thermal requirements. We were just trying to, reconcile the two things and bring them together.
All right, thank you.
Just building on that answer to the chairman's question, you say that that's where you were trying to get to with it, and you didn't want to hold up the industry. And really what I'm trying to get at is is the NHBC's motives. What was its true purpose in alighting on and then publishing option 3 as a further alternative means to compliance?
It was to, it was to assist the industry to get, to come to conclusions that these claddings would work. It wasn't being done as a way that NHBC could improve its market share, because it was being done under the BCA. We were trying to share what we'd picked up and what we knew with the rest of the building control profession.
Well, taking a step back, do you agree that NHBC's business, in part, was as an approved inspector?
Yes, it was, yes.
Yes. And an approved inspector is there to grant or withhold approval of compliance under the building regulations, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And indeed, I think you referred to it as a regulator, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Did you understand at the time that a regulator's role was ruthlessly and fearlessly and independently to consider what was in front of it and decide whether it passed and complied or failed because it didn't comply?
Yes, we were aware of that, yes.
Yes. It was, and did you consider that it was therefore not part of a regulator's role to help industry or guide industry to compliance or to get to a place. It was simply the regulator's role to decide whether a particular structure did or didn't comply. It was up to government to change the guidance. Was that the thinking, or was it not?
That was the... Yes, it was. That was what we knew our bottom line was. And, we knew at NHBC that we were not going to... Well, we didn't want to put ourselves into a position whereby we'd overstep the mark. But equally, the construction industry does work by a process of collaboration between all parties, designers, constructors, and, in a way, the regulators, the goalkeepers, and that was how it operated.
But if the goalkeeper is collaborating with the striker, what happens to the match?
Yeah, I can understand that now, yes. But, at the time, building control as a profession had wanted to move on from the days of, being very rigid to a point where it was collaborative.
Did it ever occur to you that this act of collaboration was, in one sense, corrupting because it would undermine the ruthless and fearless independence of the regulator?
Well, I think we probably knew that. But, I can't give any reasons more. Really, that was the thinking of the industry at the time, of the profession at the time. It did try to help, work with its designers.
Did you draft option 3 in order to legitimise the schemes that, to your own knowledge, NHBC historically had incorrectly approved, so far as K15 was concerned?
No, we genuinely drafted it because we knew that route to compliance also featured through the approved document, and we could not see a reason why it couldn't be applied to facades as well as it was applied to any other, part of a building.
Did anybody at the time give any consideration to the implications to the NHBC in admitting that they had signed off for some years high-rise buildings using K15 in error?
I'm not sure what the discussions were at high level.
Right. Going on to paragraph 134 of your statement at the foot of page 35, you say this: the basis for the option 3 was to adopt an assessment in lieu of tests. In lieu of tests, you say. In particular, this is based on the 2006 version, amended in 2013, of ADB, where at Appendix A, paragraph 1, it states, and then emphasis added, much of the guidance in this document is given in terms of performance in relation to British or European standards for products or methods of test, or, if you turn the page, design or in terms of European technical approvals. In such cases, the material, product or structure should B, have been assessed from test evidence against appropriate standards or by using relevant design guides as meeting that performance, or, and then you've put this in bold, note, for this purpose, laboratories accredited by UCAS for conducting the relevant tests and suitably qualified fire safety engineers might be expected to have the necessary expertise. Now first, whose idea was it to use these provisions in Appendix A as the basis of justifying the presence of option 3 in TGA 18?
The original idea was from the first Wintec meeting where we understood that this was being done, and then it was myself that put down these words taken from Appendix A.
Did you sit down with Steve Evans and actually discuss these words?
Yeah, I think we did, and certainly, it was in the first draft, and, I would have at least told Steve it's there in ADB, that's what it is.
Did you seek any external or independent opinion, for example, from Exova or from BRE, about whether these provisions you've you've put into your statement of Appendix A could be used to justify desktop assessments on something as large and complex as a tall building envelope?
We didn't see any reason why it couldn't be applied.
Sorry, that wasn't...
Yes, I know, sorry. We did discuss, we did send a copy of the BCA guidance note prior to publication. We did send a copy to BRE and ask BRE's comments on it. I can't recall whether we ran it past Exover or not, possibly not by that point, but later on it was there. The BCA members were well aware of it. There was nobody came back that said it was not suitable, and we were seeing reports from these UCAS laboratories based on it.
Yes. I mean, is the specific answer to my question that before publication you sent it to the BRE for comments? Did they come back with any comments?
No, they didn't. I can't remember even if because we had a meeting with Arup Fire as well, and I don't know if we showed it to them at that meeting either.
Well, that would have been on the 25th of November 2014.
Yes.
Some months after publication. That's the date you met Arup. I'm sorry, that's the date you met the BRE, Sarah Colwell.
Yes.
You met Arup 2 days later on the 27th of November 2014.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so that's after publication. I'm interested in before publication. So my question is, before publication, and indeed, actually before you drafted the draft, the same day as the meeting in November 2013, or even between those two dates, November 2013 and June 2014, did you go to BRE or Exover or Warrington and ask them for an opinion, a considered opinion, about whether option 3 was justified by the language of Appendix A?
No, we didn't.
Why is that?
Because I don't think we really had those routes into those organisations, particularly at the time. But we saw that the route was there through approved document B, and that was more of a building control issue, and that was why Steve opted to limit it to, BCA members.
Well, you told us this morning that you'd approached Tony Baker in May 2013 as a route into the BRE because of some previous discussion that you'd had with him in 2012 about cavity barriers. Why not use Tony Baker as your route into BRE? Why not send your draft, option 3, to Tony Baker in November 2013 or at any time before publication in June 2014 and ask him and say, Tony, we think this is justified by Appendix A and the language there. Can you please give us your view? You could have done that, couldn't you?
We could have done, but the response we got back from Tony Baker the previous time was, it's not for BRE to comment on building control approval.
Right. That's not an answer to my question. My question was about ADB and whether or not you considered going to the BRE and asking them whether or not they would support an alternative route to compliance based on Appendix A, or perhaps whether they'd ever seen it before.
Well, we knew they'd seen it because, we knew from Wintec, or we heard from Wintec, that they'd written these reports.
Yes, that's second hand. Why not go to the source before you published and say, Tony, we want to do this. Is this justified by approved document B? And is it safe?
We didn't think to do that.
Why not?
Because we didn't think that it was unsafe. We felt that it was a legitimate route supported by the approved document.
Given that given that option 3 specifically identifies BRE as one of the 3 testing houses who are going to be called upon to provide these desktops, and given that you had a route in through Tony Baker into BRE since at least 2012 and 2013, why not alert them to the fact, at the very least, that these might be coming, the requests for these might be coming down the track, and that they should be prepared to answer them? Why not even do that?
I don't know. We didn't think of it at the time.
And I'm trying to understand why you didn't think of it at the time. Can you give us an explanation?
I can't. I think, it was We genuinely, I think, thought that it was a clear-cut way through the approved document. It was supported by approved document. Approved document B was, a building control document. It was enough to run it past the other building control bodies, and that would be, sufficient.
If it was an acceptable alternative route, did you ever address your mind to the question why it wasn't referred to in section 12.5 to section 12.9 of ADB, which actually deals with the routes to compliance?
Because, well, in other parts of ADB where it talks about fire tests and things like that, it didn't have any additional guidance. The guidance on extended applications was generic guidance at the back of the approved document B. And in that guidance, it didn't say this is not suitable for this type of fire test or anything like that. It just was generic wording for assessments of fire tests.
On what basis did you think that Appendix A, in the words you've put in your statement, authorised extended application assessment for the fire performance of an external wall?
There was nothing there to suggest that it wouldn't be acceptable.
So the absence, is this right? The fact that it didn't say you couldn't use it for external walls led you to think that it could be, even though there was no reference to this approach in Section 12 itself?
It was generic guidance for fire tests.
Now, it's right to think that these kinds of assessments weren't routinely seen for high-rise residential buildings before the publication of BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, were they?
They weren't routinely seen, but we did know that they were happening.
Well, only because Wintec had told you.
And also because Kingspan had brought along in around about August 2014, Kingspan had supplied us with copies of Option 3 and Option 4 tests and reports one was from BRE and two were from Arab Fire, for schemes which we were not involved with, that had already, they'd had commissioned through those organisations.
So Options 3 and Option 4, and leave aside Option 4, how many Option 3 reports did you see in the August of 2014?
Well, there was only the one.
Yeah. And you then say at paragraph 135, I therefore considered this to be a valid and appropriate route to compliance. As it was based on the building regulations, I did not have any concerns with the inclusion of Option 3. Now, given that the building regulations are not prescriptive, and given that ADB is only guidance, why did you feel that you needed to document another option for builders to comply with the building regulations?
Because we were trying to bring about a clearer way that external walls should be being considered under Regulation B4. We were aware that in most cases building control bodies were not really focusing in on the fire performance aspect, and we wanted to try and bring it back to some sort of order.
When you had your meeting with Wintec in November 2013, did they show you an example of a desktop?
They didn't show us one, no.
Right. Did they identify any desktop by name, any project where the building control officer or AI had approved it?
They didn't, and I seem to recall they were quite careful about what names they did drop. So
you had no detail and no means of obtaining any detail about exactly what projects they had been referring to?
No, we didn't.
No. And presumably you didn't ask them?
Not at that stage, no.
So you drafted Option 3 without any outside support or expert input from BRE or Exover or Warrington Fire, without having seen any previous desktops from anybody, and solely on the basis of the second-hand say-so of Wintec, undocumented, at a meeting. Is that a fair summary?
No, because the route, the Appendix A of Approved Document B was quite clear in its wording that you can't test everything, and it is reasonable to extrapolate from tests to give an idea of performance.
Now, what words in there are you relying on when you say that?
The bits I can see in front of me, the have been assessed from test evidence against appropriate standards.
Well, we can argue about the meaning of words, but that is, in fact, is this right? At the time, those are the words you thought justified this approach, as a matter of fact. Is that correct?
Yes.
I see. Now, what was your view at the time about what amounted to an appropriate quantity of test evidence with which an external cladding system could properly be assessed against appropriate standards?
We didn't have a figure in mind of it like that. We relied upon, if a report comes in from one of these organisations, then it must be, considered by them that there was enough evidence there.
Were you concerned that when the first version, issue 0 of BCA Technical Guidance Note 18 came out, there were only a handful of successful BS 8414 tests for anything really, upon which fire specialists might be able to base their extrapolations?
Well, it all depended what was needed to be assessed. In many cases at the start, I'd take a brickwork facade. A brickwork facade used with a lightweight steel frame build-up didn't fit option 1 in the ADB, and it didn't have any 8414 test. So to use that, there was no way that could be used unless somebody did this extended application test. And I think most people, fire engineers and not, would agree that looking at what was tested, which had a cementitious panel of about 12 mil, take that off and put a 75mm brick facade in front of it, it was likely and well accepted that that brick facade was going to perform at least as well as, but most likely better than, what had already been tested.
Did you envisage, or did you have any views at all, on how closely similar the BS 8414 tests which had generated the underlying data for these desktops would have to the system being proposed?
We knew that we would expect it to have good similarities, yes.
What does that mean?
We would expect that if it was a thin panel external cladding finish, then there would be test data on some sort of thin panel cladding finish in the test. The way that those materials would act under impingement of flames, there would be some similarities there. These were things that we would have, expected to see. So, in other words, would the panel resist fire like in the way timber would before then it breached, or would it in the way like a cement panel just shatter and large areas of it would break up? Or in the case of a lightweight metal, would it just melt in the areas where it reached the melting point?
I mean, how would you know? I mean, what's the data set you'd be referring to in order to come to the decision as to whether something was sufficiently similar?
Well, that would need to be assessed from, the various tests that needed to back these, these.
That's, if I may say so, a circular answer. What was the data that, or let me put it this way, did you expect to see sufficient data to enable an expert to say whether something was sufficiently similar?
Well, we did, because Kingspan had given us their, even at the January meeting, they said we're going to test this, and this. They provided us with their proposed test, build-ups. As far as we knew, that the data was, albeit by this point maybe not quite in existence, but we knew that Kingspan were planning to do that, and data would gradually become more and more, the data pool would be bigger.
Well, let's try some examples. Would a BS 8414 test report using a riveted fixed system for the rain screen be eligible for use in an option 3 report where instead a cassette system was proposed?
It depends on what the material was.
Yes. And similarly, what about a successful test using PIR insulation? Could that be extrapolated to other PIR systems, even if they used a different cladding panel?
Well, the transference between two types of PIR manufacturer would probably be something that could be catered for under this extended application, yes.
Right. And could a system using an aluminium panel be extrapolated to cover a system using a zinc panel?
Very likely, yes.
Right, we say very likely, but it would depend on the data, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, the data, we would expect to see some evidence of fire testing or some knowledge of how those panels were going to, act under fire.
It would depend on a method, an established scientific method of extrapolation, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Did you know whether an established scientific method of extrapolation even existed?
We left that to the UCAS bodies to do that, and if they informed us that they considered it was acceptable, then we, accepted what they said. They were the experts in this, not us.
Well, that last part of the answer I understand, but let me see if I've got this right. You put option 3 out there, is this right? Not actually knowing in advance whether any of these 3 identified test houses actually had any established scientific methodology which would form the basis of the extrapolations.
Well, we did, yes, because we expected that if the data was not there, then we wouldn't get an option 3 report back.
Would it not have been sensible to check with these testing houses before putting option 3 out there whether in fact extrapolation was scientifically possible, before telling the industry at large that it was something that they should try and achieve?
For completeness, it would have probably improved things and made things a little bit more robust. But as I say, we knew at the time that there was a test for Kingspan, K15. We knew that there was I believe, a test with Extratherm, albeit an 8414 Part 1 test. We knew that these tests were occurring and were becoming more, the data pool was growing.
Was there a list of acceptable parameters in which fire specialists would have to base their opinions?
We left that to the UCAS, the labs to determine that. That was all part of the PFPF guide and the 15725 extended application standard.
Right. So is the answer to these questions where I'm giving you examples that in fact trying to predict on paper via a desktop report what would happen if a large-scale fire test was undertaken without doing small-scale testing of the components is impossible?
We weren't the experts in fire testing. That was the likes of BRE and Exover. We said, look, there's this route through ADB that looks like it can be done. We didn't go any further than that. We relied upon them to give their views as to whether it was acceptable to do that.
Right. And did that mean that the thinking about who was going to carry out these desktops pointed very strongly in the direction of extremely expertly qualified people?
We weren't aware of the, extremely. We knew it had to go along the lines of people with the right amount of knowledge in this, this particular area.
I mean, it was a reality. You didn't actually know whether option 3 reports could routinely be produced by people such as BRE, Exover or Warrington or Chiltern, but hoped that they would be, because otherwise option 3 would be pointless.
Well, we knew that they were being produced, so we knew that the option 3 route, did work, because we were hearing of and seeing,
but it might
not
work.
very many, we were seeing some reports from BRE.
It might work. It might work on occasions. But what had led you to think that it would work across the board as a general alternative to compliance?
Well, simply because the wording in the Appendix A that said, do test, and if you need to extrapolate from the test, then use this particular set of standards and guides.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is, Mr. Millett. Thank you very much. Well, I think we've done enough for one day, Mr. Lewis. We'll stop there. We'll resume tomorrow morning, please, at 10 o'clock. And again, since you're going home or wherever you're going, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
Thank you.
We look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Millett. 10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.